Thank you so much for the introduction. Thank you for the opportunity to host this conversation here. And we're really proud to be part of such an important event. That NGO that you just heard from in the video is doing some really, really important work on the ground in the Ukraine. And I think it's just the right thing to do to be able to support organizations like that. And obviously it can hopefully serve multiple purposes by hosting important conversations like this one that we're really pleased to be sharing with you. And I have two esteemed colleagues joining me here. I'll introduce them quickly, and I'll say a preamble before we really kick things off, but just to let you know that Gabby Polanco-Sordo will be joining me for this conversation. She's the head of Purpose and Sustainability at Gore Mutual Insurance. And also pleased that Garrett Jones is here. He's the Director of Sustainable Finance for the Delphi Group. And we're going to be having a lively conversation about a really, as Vinicius said, a fast and furious issue that's coming in North America. And we'll be speaking mostly about Canada, but touching on some issues related to the US as well, around mandatory climate-related financial disclosure. Really exciting area, and we'll unpack it for those of you that have been hearing about it, but maybe not following it as closely as some of us. Before we launch into that, though, I do want to acknowledge that I'm joining you today from Mohkinstsis. It's the traditional name of the place commonly known as Calgary, Alberta, Canada. And it's located in the traditional territory of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, the Stoney Nakoda, and the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. And Canada is home to First Nations, Inuit, and Aboriginal people all across what is commonly known as Turtle Island. And we honor these original peoples of this land. And in particular today, on National Indigenous Peoples Day, it's really important to talk about the fact that this is a really kind of significant milestone for Canada. We're honoring this day at a time that in the last year, especially for those of you that might not be from Canada, perhaps you weren't following that there was a really tragic discovery of more than 1,000 unmarked children's graves that were uncovered at former residential school sites. These were schools that were historically used to separate children from their parents and assimilate them into more of a Western non-Indigenous society. And Canada is really at the early stages of a process of truth and reconciliation to repair some of the wounds and really completely include Indigenous people in the future of this growing economy. And when I think about the issues that we're all sort of dealing with as context for the better future that we're trying to co-create together, I think of how difficult it is when people are coming from a place of historical or generational trauma. As a descendant of Holocaust survivors, I feel also connected to some of the wounds of the past, and how so much of that is with us today. And so when I think about Ukraine and what's happening there right now and the tragedy unfolding, it is an issue that's going to be with us for a long time to come, not just the next few years, but really we do need to commit to being part of the solution for potentially generations to come. You can do your part by going to sustainabilityforua.org, reading more about the other webinars as part of this series, but also donating to the important cause that we're all supporting here today. So thank you for having me share that as part of the context for this conversation. We're going to switch gears a little bit because there's a really opportune kind of moment here to really take the pulse of what's happening as it relates to this issue of disclosure. There's investor pressure, and in fact, let me just sort of, if this is an issue that's new to you, perhaps allow me to back up and just acknowledge that there are investors who are representing tens of trillions of dollars who need reliable information about climate risks in order to make informed investment decisions. But right now, many companies, including some of the most reputable companies in North America, are disclosing some of the risks associated with Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. But a lot of the risk is not being disclosed. It is in supply chains. It is in what's commonly known as Scope 3 emissions. And so there is an effort underway to make mandatory climate-related risk disclosures. So these are risks and opportunities associated with both the sort of impact that companies are facing as a result of the impacts of climate change, but also investors want to know, should I be investing in these companies because they are working towards being part of the solution, or are they exacerbating the challenge? So that's a bit of the context. I want to introduce once again my two colleagues that are joining me for this conversation. Once again, Gabby Polanco Soto from Gore Mutual Insurance, Garrett Jones, from the Director of Sustainable Finance at Delphi Group. Garrett, let me start with you. Help set the scene a little bit here. And what are some of the kind of recent milestones or really important highlights that have happened recently that are making this issue front and center for companies across the board?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Lior. Excuse me, thanks for setting the stage. I'm extremely honored and privileged to be here. And I would also like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you live here from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Syilx or Okanagan people. It's in beautiful Kelowna, British, now known as beautiful Kelowna, British Columbia, and just very excited to be a part of this this amazing event. Getting down to the heart of the topic is, here in the North American context, it seems to be really coming at a rapid change pace here over the last couple of years, talking about climate-related and ESG disclosures. And this really kind of set off here late last year when you look at the CSA, or the Canadian Securities Administrator, when they came out with their national instrument proposal, which was essentially going to be mandating issuers within Canada to disclose their climate-related risks. And this was aligned to the TCFD, or the Task Force on Financial Climate-Related Disclosures. There was a little bit of concern with some of the less prescriptive nature of the proposal relative to the TCFD, specifically around the Scope 1, 2, 3 disclosures and the scenario analysis. And then what you had happen earlier this year is you had the SEC out of the US, who came with quite a bit more prescriptive disclosure here proposal for issuers within the US that was really closely aligned to the TCFD. But then you also have, most recently, in the 2022 Canadian financial budget, OSFI, the Office for Superintendent Financial Institutions, throwing a lot of acronyms, but I mean, that's sustainability.
Yeah.
That's sustainability for you, right? It's all acronyms. They came out with their new mandate for financial institutions, which was, again, closely aligned with the TCFD. So when you look at it from the Canadian context, there's maybe been a little bit of feedback, if you will, to the CSA on, maybe the prescriptive nature, the less prescriptive nature of their recommendation relative to kind of the industry standards. And talking on OSFI, I think that obviously Gabby, with her experience, would be and working directly in the financial sector now. Maybe you'll talk a little bit more about it. But from my perspective, I'd like to just really say it's exciting times here in Canada and North America, and to see these a amalgamation and a move towards a kind of more standard around climate related disclosures, kind of meeting the global more of the global standards. So pretty exciting times here.
Yeah, thank you for setting the scene. And that was a little bit of a acronym alphabet soup. And so I put a couple of the full acronym names in the chat there for folks, just as some guidance. I'll do a little bit more of that. But Gabby, let me bring you into the conversation as well. And as an insurance company, I think you're in a really interesting place in all this, right? Because so OSFI that Garrett mentioned, which is really regulating the federally regulated banks and insurance companies. Really, they're talking about mandating this. They're asking for feedback right now. Why do you think that there's kind of a big spotlight right now on the banks and insurance companies in particular?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that it's been primarily because if you think about it, usually the financial system is what I would call the nervous system of a body, of the economy in any country and globally. And so I think it makes sense to start with financial institutions, primarily because whatever financial institutions start implementing is going to have a trickle effect across every industry. And, from an insurance company perspective, we're in such a unique position because we are our job is to manage risk. Climate change risk is not new. It's something that insurance companies have been looking at for a long time, looking at catastrophes, et cetera. The momentum in which it's coming, though, and the data required is less about looking back at what's happened historically, but more about what might happen in the future. And I think that based on the expertise that insurance companies have, they're really the first temperature check to say where are certain industries going. The reinsurers are even more at the forefront, where they're going to be the first to act when they feel that a certain risk is just not worth having on their books. And so I think that it makes a lot of sense for OSFI to be starting, or OSFI would start, but it makes sense to start really with financial institutions, just knowing that trickle down effect will have an impact across all industries.
Yeah, and just a bit of a follow-up, so insurance plays an important role. As you said, there's insurance and banks are kind of the nervous system of the economy. But are you seeing where companies are saying, you know what, yes, maybe investor pressure is driving us in this direction, but actually we also want lower insurance premiums, and so that's potentially a benefit. Is that something that's quantifiable?
Yeah, I think there's pressure on all fronts. I think I'll be really transparent that as a mutual company, we don't have shareholders. We are really owned by policyholders, so it's a unique position. But when you look at publicly traded companies, you have both shareholders that are proponents of more ESG management and those that are less. And I think that you're seeing that pressure really play out right now in the market. And you're right that there is that sense of people wanting lower premiums and always wanting to kind of get at that level. But at the same time, I think the biggest risk is not just lower premiums, but that there are going to be entire communities, and we see this globally, that are going to at some point be uninsurable. And this is where I think in Europe, we're seeing this a lot more, where there are safety nets being developed by governments to really protect those communities that are going to become uninsurable. And I think that is really at the forefront of some of the future risks that we're looking at, is what's going to happen to those communities. And I know at the last session, there was a lot of talk about equity. And for us at Gore Mutual, part of our climate change strategy is actually around just transition. And I know we talk about that in a second, but there's that whole proponent around really protecting those that are going to be most impacted by climate change. And undeniably, those are usually people that are still within, the lower margins of the economy, and usually representative minorities or underrepresented groups. And so for us, we see that as all being connected in terms of really ensuring that we're creating a future where everyone can thrive.
Yeah, let's definitely circle back to that just transition conversation. Such an important one. And I don't know how you talk about climate without talking also about the impact on people. But before we go there, question for you, Garrett. Can you unpack a little bit about what's happening in the investment world exactly? Like, so are companies, are investors looking at these companies and saying, kind of like what Gabby was saying, through our portfolios, we are investing in all of these organizations that are essentially driving the economy at the moment, but we think potentially they're going off of a cliff. Is that kind of the sort of calculation that these companies are making, as that they're demanding more disclosure?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. There's definitely quite a bit, to unpack. And I think, one of the things to really understand is when you talk about, let's say, ESG, environmental, social, and governance indicators, right? And this kind of term got coined from the investment world, right? It really wasn't designed to necessarily be around impact. This was designed for, really profit and being able to start to understand what were those, those risks relative to, to these organizations. But, what you're starting to see, what I've been seeing over the course of the last kind of few years is this amalgamation of that sustainability and ESG, if you will, right? And really, you almost can't talk about one without the other, with ESG being, the material indicators that really define an organization's sustainability at, maybe at the basic level, right? But where you're seeing is a demand from stakeholders, right, and from shareholders to have these disclosures and have this transparency reported on the annual filings of issuers, right? And so this is where, in the absence of clear regulation and policy, that you've seen kind of this rise of, rating agencies, et cetera, fill the void, especially in North America, in the absence of mandatory disclosures or regulation, if you will. But now we're seeing kind of this, we're in this transition, if you will, when it comes to disclosures, where mandatory requirements are, in the North American context, are about to come into place. There's a little bit of ambiguity still in the market where, which can create a little bit of greenwashing when it comes to kind of disclosures and investment funds, right? So what I'm really hoping for in this transition is that there is that kind of consistency when you look at disclosures, right? And that's from kind of the company, the issuer, disclosing, that clear global standard and having same standards, across the board to disclose that. And then the investment manager that is wrapping these funds or putting these funds and selling these funds, that has that kind of clear, transparent language that is still holding the issuers accountable. But me as a consumer or retail investor, I know that the investment that I am choosing is what it says it is. It's not a ESG labeled fund, and I can feel good about it, but I know transparently, I know that it is transparent in its disclosures, especially around what it's looking to do, let's say in the scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, right? And being able to fully disclose that. And we're still in that period of not quite there of maturing, but I think that, that we will get there as we continue to kind of demand that from stakeholders, as shareholders and stakeholders continue to demand that. So I hope I kind of answered. I danced around it a little bit, but hopefully I was able to provide a little bit of context.
Yeah, let's come back around to that as well, because I want to get your thoughts as well, Gabby. But in addition, you also introduced a point that I want to double click on. You talked about the greenwashing, the need to make sure that the data is actually of quality and it's robust. Recently, Tesla got knocked off of a well-known ESG rating organization, and Elon Musk, the sort of very high-profile richest man in the world, Tesla, SpaceX. I'm sure there's very few people who don't know who he is. His response to being knocked off the ESG rating was ESG is a scam. And it's significant that he said that, partly because what a large following he has, partly because here's somebody who I think has a reputation for affecting, very bold, ambitious, positive change through the, especially Tesla, but through the many investments that he's made. And the point that he was also making was the fact that ExxonMobil, obviously, in the business of fossil fuels, is on the same ESG rating. So, Gabby, let me go to you first on in reaction to that, but I want to get you both your thoughts on it. Does Elon have a point?
So I think it's a manifestation of many things, and I think if we go back when I first joined and started working in the sustainability space, it was early DJSI days, and there were not that many kind of rating organizations. But when you think back to those early days, really it was about, and we were all excited from a corporate sustainability space because it was a way to recognize leaders and incentivize laggards. Really, that was what it was all about. And I think it became a whole industry in and of itself. And what ended up happening was that a lot of us, that we're trying to get into the boardrooms to talk about climate change and to talk about human rights and other issues, that was the way in, because as soon as these rankings would come out, someone would call from the C-suite to say, the CEO wants to know why we didn't make this list, but yet our competitors did. And so it became a bit of a competition. And I think back, to 2010, a lot of the Canadian banks had, their goals around ESG or sustainability was to make some sort of rating and ranking. And many of you right now would just, think back and say, oh my goodness, I can't believe we did that. But it wasn't about understanding the actual ratings. It was about just getting that score and being able to put it on your website. And I think what's happening now is that has manifested itself into a lot of questions. There's no consistency in a lot of the rating agencies, and a lot of them, there's actually no transparency. They sell back your data to you in order to actually to give you an analysis. So there's a lot of things going on there. And I think that's also helping to feed some of these type of comments and dialogue that's happening around the rating agencies, because the markets and a lot of analysts, when you think back a few years back, didn't have the expertise to go in and actually analyze a company based on their true performance and what they were disclosing, because again, going back to Garrett's point, it was all over the map. They couldn't really compare anything. So they really used these rating agencies and the rankings as a proxy to evaluate how a company was doing. What I would suggest, and I could be wrong, is that little by little analysts and asset managers are actually becoming more informed in terms of how to really evaluate ESG, and are using less the results, the rankings, and more the data that's being pulled by these rating agencies to actually do their own analysis, and less emphasis a bit, on what the actual scores are for companies. But there's still a lot of education that needs to happen. But I do think that it has been a manifestation that us in the sustainability world have also contributed to. But at this point, I think that we have so much momentum in sustainability that I think it's a call to action for a lot of rating agencies to really try to explain their methodologies, be more transparent about what it is that they're doing. And for us in the corporate side, to educate our executives what ratings and rankings actually do, what they're measuring, how they all differ from each other, and use more of our effort to actually create change as opposed to trying to chase score methodologies and ratings and rankings in the end. So it's part of the evolution of this space, but I would love to kind of hear Garrett's points as well.
Yeah, great context. Like because you've been in this space a while, Gabby, you can see that full context of how it's evolved and where it still needs to evolve. I appreciate that. Garrett, anything to add to that?
No, extremely well said. Obviously, Gabby, from your direct experience, obviously from the kind of the inception of this of this space here over the course of the last kind of 15 years or so. But you mean to tell me ESG is more than just window dressing? That's the case. Okay, so then if that's the case, then no, ESG is, simply put, is not a scam, right? And I agree with a lot of what obviously what Gabby has said here, right? And with that being said, is I do believe that Mr. Musk has really highlighted some areas of improvement, right, and ambiguity within the industry, right? And that's not to say that I agree with what he was saying by any stretch of the imagination, but when you have a individual with a megaphone that is that loud, that can reach the audience that it does, is it does maybe shine some light on some areas that we need, as especially within this industry, need to work on and get better at, right? And when you look at kind of the evolution and the maturity of it, I mean, there's going to be growing pains, but for him, for Tesla to be delisted from the S&P ESG 500, right? I mean, obviously that was big news, but I think it also highlights that it is more than just the E, for example, in ESG. I think it really highlighted some of the social and governance issues that Tesla has. And without going too deep into that, right? I mean, that was, the crux of the, why Tesla was delisted, right? When you look at some of the controversies around kind of, the human capital element and the lack of transparency in their governance. I mean, that really is, to be honest, that's ESG doing its job to a certain degree, right? It's like, hey, look, yeah, you're solving this huge problem, but you're also doing it in a not a socially just way, potentially. So, I mean, I think right there, that just kind of, to a certain degree, it's doing its job, right? Now, does that say that we don't need to evolve? 100%. We continue to do that, and as regulators continue to step in, right? I think and I hope, right, that we will continue to get more transparency and more available data. And one of the things that Gabby really highlighted is, yes, we didn't have the expertise to analyze the available data, and we were solely relying on these ESG rating firms that arose out of the absence of clear regulation and standards across the board. So now what I hope and what we're starting to see is this kind of amalgamation of standards and frameworks, right, and more transparency from organizations and individuals, whether it's individuals as an investor or as an institutional investor, where I can actually go in and find my own data and create my own funds, right, and not be reliant solely on a rating agency. So and I think as we look at, going back to kind of your original question in here right off the hop, is how things have changed and progressed so quickly. I think of it's this quote that Peter Routledge, who is the new head of OSFI, came out in October of last year, and he said, quoted Martin Luther King Jr. and said, "The fierce urgency of now, and more than ever, we need to have this kind of transparency, this consistency, and fight kind of climate change and these social issues that we're seeing across the board." So I just wanted to highlight that.
There's a lot to unpack in what you said there. There's a lot of good points that you raised, and I'll just pick up on one of them if I could, which is around the call for more transparency, the fact that there's all this data around the environment, the need for at least an equal amount of transparency around the S, or social issues, potentially labor issues, and I guess the question that I'm driving at is like the amount of resources it takes to actually measure and develop the data that's required here. Part of the equation is how do you make sure that the data is like really good quality data? So that's I think can be a challenge for some organizations, especially if they have very complex supply chains. But the other question is maybe, or is it possible that an ExxonMobil might actually have more resources that they have for like a disclosure team, because there's kind of a lot of track record there, and have been built up. A lot of shareholders over time that they have activist shareholders that have kind of moved them into certain directions, so they've built up teams to do this. Whereas a Tesla, perhaps, they're in some ways operating kind of like with a startup mindset. Don't put all of your resources into data collection. Is that part of it? Is data collection just a really kind of behemoth undertaking for organizations? Gabby, let me ask you about that.
I think it could be if you're chasing ratings and rankings, because organizations that have big budgets will actually hire expert consultants to fill out the surveys and questionnaires. There's a methodology to it. You do very clearly kind of understand how the scoring works. There's gap analysis done, etc. But that's the ratings and rankings. I think when it comes to data collection, and whether it's whether it's E data, S data, or G data, if you understand the underlying risk and opportunities for your business and your industry, you can really focus your efforts on those key metrics that are most important to you. And so I think, taking a very focused approach in terms of what you should be measuring, why it's important, and how it adds value to decision making, it will get you a long way. But again, you have to be willing to say the ratings and rankings don't matter to me right now. Right now, we're really focused on kind of driving that change. And I think that companies that do that get more value actually out of the data, because ultimately the value of disclosure is not the end report that you either submit or issue or release at the end of the year. The value is how the data that you're collecting is going to help you make better decisions as an organization. And that's really where the true value is. And so you could create an entire huge disclosure team and have them do these beautiful reports and get really great efforts on ratings and rankings, but you're still losing a lot of the value that will be gained from actually becoming a sustainable business in the long term and becoming resilient for all the change that is going to occur based on the data that you're actually collecting.
Great.
So I always say to small organizations, don't fear the disclosure part. It is part of the journey, and you can do it with small teams. Just be very, very focused in terms of what it is that you're going to want to track and measure.
Yeah, so focus. I like that. Understanding what's most material for your organization. That's really great advice. Garrett, when Gabby said you can hire consultants to do a lot of that work, I saw you put your hand up there, because that's a lot of what you do for clients, isn't it? So what are you learning through that process with those that are outsourcing some of this to you?
Yeah. Thank you for the great plug, Gabby. Appreciate it. But I want to come back to that, but I want to, as you would say, Leo, or double click on something that Gabby said that and we had this conversation last week that I found very interesting, completely agrees, is the value isn't necessarily in the data that you're collecting, but the methodologies that you're using to integrate that data, or that ESG data, into your decision-making process. And I think that that's really where the value is, right? Like, if you're not necessarily looking at just, hey, I want to be listed on the S&P ESG 500, or I want to get a strong rating on with, whatever rating agency that there is, right? But you're actually looking at developing those methodologies internally, right? As you're going through kind of that discovery and that disclosure, right? And then how you integrate that into your decision-making process. I mean, I think that that's where the rubber meets the road, if you will, right? And when you look at, how can I use scenario, climate scenario analysis that's looking out, mid-century, late century, and how can I use, the risks and the opportunities that I've identified and potentially look to condense that and put that into my existing ERM, my enterprise risk management, or my, those kind of methodologies, and especially in the financial sector. I mean, there's a huge value in that, not necessarily about that, that public disclosure that you've made at the end of the year that has a, pretty window dressing on it, right? I think that that's huge value. But I think, back to your, your original question here to me is, because it is a new and emerging area of practice, especially here in North America, right? Not everyone is as experienced as, as Lior or as Gabby in the industry. And so when, a lot of the clients and individuals that we're dealing with, they are at the inception of their, of their journey, right? And so one of the biggest things that, you get that paralysis by analysis, right? Like, hey, well, where do I start? Do I go to a rating agency? Do I go to a consultant, right? Like, do I go B Corp? What is that? Where do I even start my journey, right? And I think, the first thing, and kind of to what Gabby was alluding, is aligning kind of this, the direction that you want to go, your aspirations around kind of being a good corporate citizen with kind of your values and your vision, and kind of creating that, right? And then really looking to curate the data that you need, right, to make those decisions that are going to get you to that aspirational goal, if you will. And then it almost kind of looks like, literally have a graph in some of our executive education, where it's a pyramid that really just shows like vision is, your vision, your why is at the spear, at the tip of that, of that sphere, if you will, right? And that is where kind of like it all starts, right? If you're starting at the base of that pyramid is your disclosure, right? So if you're starting at the disclosure where, hey, what, I just got to do this to satisfy a regulator, satisfy a shareholder, or satisfy a stakeholder, you're doing it for the wrong reasons, and you're not really going to get out of it what you could be, is if, like Gabby said, where you're really looking at it to understand, using these methodologies, right, and playing with the data to make those those integrate them into your decision-making process. So hopefully that kind of answered it a little bit. I'll step down from my soapbox here.
Yeah, no, that is helpful. And I'm hearing some similar things from both of you on that front, where it's, and I think you drove the point really well, Garrett, about it depends on your starting point. If your starting point is, this is the kind of organization we want to be and the kind of impact that we want to have, that's going to get you to some outcomes that might benefit you from a strategic point of view. If you're doing it as a checkboxing exercise because somebody has told you need to do it, then really you're going to struggle just to sort of meet the basic minimum rather than actually leverage it as a strategic opportunity. So that's kind of what I'm hearing. Hopefully I didn't put words in your mouth there. But let me go specific again before we come back out and wrap it up here. With regards to specificity, so the SEC, or Securities and Exchange Commission in the U.S., has come out with this proposal saying that all large publicly traded companies are going to be mandated to report on their Scope 1, their Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions. So that's pretty significant. The framework for how you do that is really tied to TCFD, which we talked about, Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. As part of that, there is something called scenario analysis. And this seems to be one of the pieces that some of the companies in Canada that have given their feedback to the CSA, which is kind of like the equivalent of SEC in the US, but different. And the CSA that has come out with a much more watered down sort of version of a proposal that and what the SEC has said and said, yes, just scope 1 and 2 are what will likely be required. Can you unpack that a little bit? Why is scenario analysis kind of like a stumbling block for some companies? And how significant is it for two regulators in North America to have vastly different requirements? Garrett, let me start with you, and I want to get both of your thoughts on that. And you,
that's a great question. When you look at, let's say, the Task Force on Financial Climate related disclosures, and when they came out with their final recommendations in 2017, really the quantitative analysis of financial climate related disclosures, or climate related financial disclosures, was through scenario analysis and your GHG emissions, right? And that was your metrics, targets, and the strategy around making reductions in those areas, right? So for the SEC, or pardon me, for the CSA, I'm getting my own acronyms mixed up here, for the CSA to come out and not be aligned with the TCFD and with SEC, I think it was a little bit of a surprise, right? Because some people would say they kind of gutted out the really the kind of heart, if you will, of the TCFD around scenario analysis. And they kind of CSA took a position of comply or explain, essentially, right? Which is counterintuitive to the rest of the market. And part of the reason that they came out is the CSA, when they released their proposal there in October of last year, is they were doing this to align with global standards. Right, but right off the hop, they're already not aligning with global standards. So in turn, consequently, could Canadian issuers or Canadian companies or organizations or entities already be kind of behind the 8 ball? And this could inadvertently or inadvertently put us at risk of lack of capital or loss of capital, not understanding risk, not adequately understanding the risks, and not adequately understanding the opportunities. I think Canada, it's more important than almost, you could make the argument that Canada, being such a resource-driven economy, that it's so important for us to have those scenario analysis and really being able to understand what are the transitional risks, right? What does that look like? Like, not just the physical risks, but what are the transitional risks? And that kind of leads into talking about just transition. And if we're not able to disclose, to identify that, then that's a huge gap that that we have as an organization and as a country, right? And let's be clear, scenario analyses are not a financial pro forma, right? They are not holding you, to this set outcome. Right, what it is it is a series of scenarios that are relevant to you as an organization, to your industry, and to your geographic location, and that really can start to look and make you think about what are the risks and opportunities in these different scenarios, mid and late century. And without the foresight to have that and to strategically think that, then you are really kind of losing out on the key, or the heart of the essence, if you will, of the TCFD from my perspective.
Gabby, your thoughts on that too, and in particular, like what are you seeing as the potential impact of the two different regulatory requirements in Canada and the US?
Well, to be frank, I think the Canadian one is not going to help anybody. I think that especially multinational organizations are already having to disclose at a much higher standard than we're being asked to in Canada in general. In Europe, they're much further ahead than we are. And now I would suspect that the US has somersaulted us, because I think that we were on a much quicker path before. And so I don't think it's helping us. I think I would agree with Garrett. I think all of this is ultimately about risk management. Organizations, big and small, like I would say Gore Mutual, ourselves, we're in the process right now of quantifying our financed emissions. We're likely one of the first mutual insurance companies in Canada that's going to be able to publicly disclose that at the end of the year. And we're not doing this for the sake of the disclosure piece. We're doing it because, again, we know that we need to understand the risks that are associated with, the transitional risk associated with our financed emissions. We know that at some point we are going to get new guidelines regarding insurance associated emissions, which is around our underwriting. That's going to be a huge lift for the insurance industry as well, but something that we need to prepare for, meaning that we're not going to wait for the regulation to come. This is something that as soon as the guidance comes out, we're going to start looking at and starting to build that muscle internally, knowing that it's, again, going to help us make better decisions. So I think that having more watered down regulation is really not helping the Canadian industry really prepare the way we should be for all of the different risks associated to climate change.
Very strong points you're making there, and I think, very clearly stating that it's actually a risk for the Canadian economy to not be more ambitious with the regulation. Is that what I'm hearing, Gabby?
Yeah.
Yeah, and so let's come back to this point that's come up a few times in this conversation, which is around this whole idea around just transition. And so I guess the main question is, when some people look at kind of new regulatory requirements that are coming specifically around what a company is disclosing, some people wouldn't make the connection that, oh, this relates to an opportunity to have to bring sort of equity into our economy. But do you see it that way, Gabby? Do you see that this is actually an opportunity to reshape the economy in some way?
Mm-hmm. I do, and I think that if we don't think about it, it will be catastrophic for certain communities in Canada. And I primarily equate it to, the fisheries in Atlantic Canada, in the early 70s and 80s, where entire communities were wiped out. And really it was the death of an industry in Canada. And so you fast forward now, and that's really what transition risk is, the risk that entire industries, entire communities that are based on sometimes very specific industries, depend on them for employment, for community investment, for development, even for infrastructure. And some of them, they're going to be ultimately at risk. And so, from my perspective, one of the things that I've been thinking about the most, because early in my career, I was on the community investment side. And what I've noted is that as climate change has become more important, the discussion around community investment has been left behind, or it's been moved to the marketing team. A lot of the teams are not usually together. But the way I see it is, when you're coming out as a company with community investment, with climate change targets and climate change plan and looking at transition, you should have your community investment in the other hand, thinking, how can we support these communities prepare for that type of transition, whether it's around economic development, whether it's training and looking at, potentially green tech for some of, the population that's working right now in oil and gas. And so there's a lot that you can actually do from a community investment perspective that's closely linked with your climate change strategy. And this is going to, again, foster resilience in those communities that are ultimately going to be impacted. And this has been, I think, the scariest part for Canada. When the big green taxonomies were coming out in Europe a few years ago, what it was really doing was actually closing the market for a lot of big Canadian industries. And so, part of the transition initially in Canada had been, how can we maintain these open markets while still being able to meet some of the requirements that are coming, and those are becoming even more stringent now. And so I think for any company that's starting to look at climate change, don't forget that there is an S associated with this, and think about how community investment really can be a strategic tool to help drive some of the change that you're looking to make.
Cool, good points, and interesting that you tied that back to community investments. Obviously, there is a kind of a reporting aspect associated with investments, right? How are you investing the sort of money and communicating that to maybe not for your company, because you said you don't have shareholders, but for companies that do, obviously shareholders do want to know how a company is investing their money into the community. So you're saying it is an opportunity to actually help the community with a transition that would otherwise be very, well, potentially devastating. Garrett, anything to add to that? And in particular, I guess, there's a question in there, which is, can disclosure lead to some kind of positive impact rather than just sort of like helping to identify, where is the risk for investors?
Yeah, Gabby said it so well. We talk about stranded assets, and I come from the banking sector, right? And we talk about just transition, and I hate to say it, to take the human element, but there's going to be, especially in the Canadian economy, there's going to be a lot of stranded assets, and these are individuals and people, right, that are going to be left behind, is if we don't think about what this looks like from a just perspective. And I think that's fundamental. And I think that the financial sector, as Gabby said, that is the nervous center, or the connected tissue, for the economy. I think that it's extremely important that we develop financial instruments, right, and a pathway forward. Now, it's not a silver bullet, it's silver buckshot, but I mean, it's key and fundamental, especially in the Canadian context that is such a resource-based economy, right? And look, why are we all here? Right, we're here because of the war in Ukraine, to help them. And when you talk about, on the global scale, what is transpiring, right, is energy security. Right. And when you talk about that, right, and you talk about the position that Canada and other very resource rich economies, right, that are now put in this position, I think more than ever, right, is we better not be doubling down on oil and gas. We're doubling down on renewable energy and just transition, right, and creating that energy security for, economies and nations and communities, across the planet. I think it's such an important aspect for Canada, right, because we can talk about a transition, right, but it doesn't mean anything if you don't have the human element into it, because it's all for naught. Right. And, one thing that I talk about is sustainability, and kind of this, this goal mark that you had said, right, or this check mark, Lior, right? It's this constant balance and, equilibrium that we have with planet, business, and people and communities. And I think, coming back to your original question, I kind of went on a little bit of a tangent, if you will, knowing there's only a few minutes, and just wanted to get some key points in there. I think that disclosure is, and transparency is key. And this is why I think scenario analysis, right, in that context is fundamental, because one of the things it does is physical risk, but also transitional risk, and really understanding what those transitional risks are to your organization, and what are those stranded assets. And in Canada, we have this amazing economy that was built, yes, on resources, but when you look at some of the individuals and the smarts, and we start to put that to work, and we already are on this, just transition, and you look at, especially in, Alberta and in the prairies here in Canada, the amazing individuals and workers, right? If we start to, retool them and repurpose and refocus and re-educate and train them, to tackle this problem, it's where the problem will be tackled.
Yeah, I appreciate your comments. I just for anybody that might be listening, sort of that maybe has like connotations around sort of like you're going to retool me, re-educate me, and seeing that as a negative thing. I think the points that are being made around this idea of like a just transition isn't necessarily doing something to people, but really including them in the economy and asking, right, how do you want to be involved in the economy that's emerging and benefit from where the puck is going? Very Canadian saying, for those of you that aren't accustomed to hearing that. I have one final question, then I'm going to turn it over to Vinicius, who's going to take us home here. Keep this question to 4 words at the most if you can, okay? And the last question is, for companies that are very early in their journey, or have yet to really sort of get to the stage where they're like, oh my gosh, disclosing all of my climate data, I have no idea where I could possibly begin. Gabby, a really quick sort of what's your first thing that comes to your mind in terms of where can somebody get started?
One really quick thing, I'm Latina, I cannot do anything in 4 words, so, but I will try. I would say just start searching for the data. This actually takes a bit of time. Understand where it lives within the organization. For a lot of organizations, when they're starting, a lot of it is based on estimates. but it at least gives you a good big picture about where it is. So I would say start doing a bit of a discovery of understanding where the data lives. Getting accurate on it takes practice, but really it's about putting a puzzle together. And once you understand where the data is coming from and where you have gaps and where you need to do some of the estimation, a lot of it starts kind of coming together. And again, don't wait for it to become regulation. This takes years to get your handle on. Like, as I said, at Gore Mutual, we're about to start disclosing our finance emissions. And this is in anticipation of regulation that for an organization of our size is actually not going to be until around 2025. But again, it's about really building that muscle internally and understanding where the data lives, and then figuring out how you can get value from that data from a strategic perspective.
Awesome. So don't wait. Uncover the data and understand how it can benefit your company. Garrett, last word to you. Same question.
Delphi Group.
Plug for the consulting.
Give us a call. We'll help you with that. But yeah, completely agree. Start somewhere, right? For sure, with your vision, right? And I think that's a good point. And I would totally agree with everything that Gabby said. But hey, thank you so much, Lior. It was just an absolute honor and privilege and super humbling to be a part of this. And thank you.
That's our time. You've been watching Gabby Polanco-Sordo from Gore Mutual Insurance, Garrett Jones from the Delphi Group. I'm Leo Rothschild from CBSR. Thank you so much for joining us. And now it's my pleasure to hand it over to Vinicius, who's going to give us more context and more information about what's next.